Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the distinction that Aristotle draws between character virtues and intellectual virtues. This distinction is at the heart of the theory that Aristotle develops in the Nicomachean Ethics. And the Nicomachean Ethics is a sprawling, very important, thorough work of ethics that Aristotle develops. And because of its sprawling and thorough nature, we can't really hope to be complete in this episode. Instead, I'm going to try to circumscribe some of the most important ideas related to the distinction between character and intellectual virtues and begin to talk about some of these ideas. We'll have to revisit the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics in other episodes, including some of the ideas that touch directly upon what we're going to be talking about today. Perhaps the right way to jump into this topic is by talking about what Aristotle thinks virtue in general is. A virtue in general is the state of something when it's at its best or when it's able to perform its characteristic activity the best. For that reason, some people prefer to leave the word a virtue untranslated and they'll just call it arete because the notion I just pointed out of something performing its characteristic activity well might not map on to our normal English word virtue. Some people prefer to translate the word arete as excellence instead, which does capture the heart of what I've just mentioned, but leaves out its moral dimension. And certainly in a work like the Nicomachean Ethics, the moral dimension does matter quite a lot. Virtue is something that's praiseworthy, and vice, which is its opposite, is blameworthy. So when we return to this idea of virtue as the state of something when it's at its best or when it's performing its characteristic activity well, we could illustrate this idea with some examples. So, for example, the a knife is virtuous when it cuts well. An ear is virtuous when it hears well, and so on. That's because both of those things are in a state when they're performing their characteristic activity the best. If we had a knife, for example, that was just a really, really good paperweight and didn't cut well, we wouldn't praise that knife. We wouldn't call it a great knife. Therefore, we would be denying its virtue. Even if it's good at some things, it's not good at what its characteristic activity is. Of course, then we could begin to identify virtuous dogs and virtuous cats and virtuous horses. But first, we would need to be clear on what exactly is the virtuous activity of a dog. And I suspect there would be a lot of disagreement on something like that, just as there's a lot of disagreement about what a good human being is. Maybe some people would say that a virtuous dog is one that plays fetch well, whereas other people would say a virtuous dog is one that is really nice, and others might say that it's about obedience and so on. But ideally, having the notion of a characteristic activity as our North Star, so to speak, would help us resolve some of these disagreements. Because what we could do is just identify the characteristic activity of a thing and then ask, well, does this thing perform its characteristic activity well, right? Does this knife cut well, knowing, of course, that cutting things well is the characteristic activity of knives? So that's a very important idea here. And when we turn to human beings, we have to ask similarly, what is the characteristic activity of a human being? Now, it's at the heart and soul of Aristotle's ethical theory that we should identify the characteristic activity of a human being because that will tell us what virtue is, and then it will also tell us what an ingredient of the good, happy life for a human being is. Now, that could be surprising. Some of us might not obviously recognize a role that morality or virtue or ethics plays in happiness. For some people, being happy might just be something that is completely independent of virtue. In fact, some people might even think they're opposed, that sometimes being virtuous or good actually requires putting aside our happiness. On the other hand, some people might have the idea that virtue is sufficient for happiness. That is, if you are virtuous, you are happy. Or if you are a good person, you are happy. And that's all there is to it, according to such a view. This idea would take us too too much time to unpack in this episode. So I'm just going to note that Aristotle holds the view that virtue is necessary for happiness but isn't sufficient for it. In other words, that virtue is one thing you need to be happy, but you also need a bunch of other things, such as health, friendship, some degree of wealth, and so on. In fact, you need some of those things in order to be virtuous. So not only do you need more than just virtue to be happy, but you actually also need some of these things in order to be virtuous. For example, you need money in order to be in order to have the virtue of generosity. You need health in order to exercise all of the many virtues that require some activity of your body. But Aristotle makes this distinction because makes this distinction between character and intellectual virtue because there are actually different things in us that each have their own characteristic activity. So they each have their own virtue. So, for example, there's one part of us that has reason. There is another part of us that doesn't have reason, but that can obey it. And there are still other parts of us too, such as the part of us that's responsible for growth, nutrition, digestion, and so on. The beating of our hearts, and other unconscious physiological processes. But we don't have to talk about that part of us. For this episode, we could actually just make a distinction between the part of us that has reason and the part of us that doesn't have reason, but that can obey reason as a child obeys a father, which is the image that Aristotle uses quite often. So, since there are these two parts of us, and they have their own characteristic activity, there are going to be at least two different kinds of virtues. One virtue for the part of us that has reason, which Aristotle calls intellectual virtues, and one virtue for the part of us that doesn't have reason but that can obey it as a child does a father. And that's what we're going to call the character virtues. Now the it might be the simplest way that we could ever define these virtues or ever hope to define these virtues is just in the way I've just outlined. That these are two different parts of us, and therefore there are two different sets of virtues for each one, i.e., two different kinds of characteristic activities for each one. And it just comes down and that basically it's like saying that a knife has a virtue that's distinct from an ear. Of course they have two different kinds of virtues, they have two different characteristic activities, but there are actually more differences between the intellectual and character virtues than just that they're two different things with their own characteristic activities. We should say something first about what the character virtues are. So if it helps for you to get examples before we dig deeper into the character virtues, then I'll just give you some examples of them. Character virtues would be something like um, courage, generosity, and so on. Being calmness, being patient. That would be a character virtue as well. Friendliness, What they have in common is that they are virtues that each have their own particular emotion. Courage, of course, being the character virtue associated with fear and feelings of rashness and boldness. Calmness being the character virtue that pertains to anger and so on. And presumably, there are emotions we have that we can't name or can't easily name, and that even for these there are going to be character virtues, and they have and we might not even be able to name the character virtues or the vices, but regardless, if there is an emotion for it, there's a character virtue of it. And so character virtues can be defined as the characteristic activity or the state of the best part, the state of us that that does not have reason but that can obey it. When it's performing its characteristic activity well, that's when it has character virtues. So again, there's a part of us that doesn't have reason but that can obey it, and when that part of us is such that it performs its characteristic activity well, that's when we have character virtues. So this part of us that doesn't have reason but that can obey it is the part of us that has emotions. Again, the part of us that does not have reason but that can obey it is our emotions, or is the home of our emotions. All of our emotions live there. Aristotle does not think that when you are virtuous, you have eliminated your emotions. That's neither desirable nor possible. It is not desirable to eliminate your emotions, and it is not possible to eliminate your emotions. Instead, what we can do, thanks to our reason, is regulate our emotions to what's appropriate for each circumstance. So when we talk about obeying reason, which is an idea I've mentioned like 10 times now, when I've mentioned the reason why I've mentioned obedience to reason is because reason regulates our emotions, at least when we're virtuous. There are plenty of people who cannot do this, but when we can obey reason, when we can bring our emotions in line with reason, we're not eliminating our emotions. We're just regulating them to what's appropriate to the circumstance. This is what Aristotle calls a mean or an intermediate. That's not mean like being cruel. That's not mean like a means to an end. That's a mean like a medium or median or intermediate between two extremes, like an average. Except this average isn't like a mathematical average. So the average between 2 and 4 is 3. But 3 is always the average between those two numbers. But the average or the mean between the intermediate between being super duper reckless and being super duper cowardly, the intermediate between them actually changes depending on the circumstances. So that's one important feature of a character virtue. So I'll illustrate this with an example. Let's say that you were being chased by a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And you were standing and you decided to stand up to the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Virtually everyone would agree that you're being incredibly reckless, stupidly reckless. So we would, and the reason is that there's no chance of survival if you're standing up to a Tyrannosaurus Rex. You should run away. In fact, we might not even blame you for curling down in the fetal position. It's a for Tyrannosaurus Rex, for goodness sake. But the problem is that if we are inferring from this example that recklessness always looks like standing your ground, that would be a mistake. Recklessness does not always look like standing your ground. Here's an example that illustrates it. I'm a Navy SEAL armed to the teeth. Armed to the teeth. I'm in a corner store, and a robber tries to rob the cashier. I'm a Navy SEAL. I'm armed to the teeth. Standing my ground is not reckless in this situation. Standing the ground might just even be regarded as the obvious, uncontroversial thing for me to do. And so this is an example of when standing your ground becomes the appropriate thing to do. This is what's right in this situation for me. If I were a 99-year-old grandma in this situation, yeah, no one would think that I should stand up to this person, to this robber. In this situation, you might actually expect me to hide. And we could multiply examples of this sort of thing easily. Um, right? There are going to be tons of examples. And the reason why there are tons of examples is because fear is the sort of thing that looks appropriate in different circumstances differently. So appropriate fear looks different depending on what time it is, what's the external world it is, what's going on in the external world, I mean, and who I am and what I'm capable of and how what my body's like in that situation, right? Um, Walking through a forest at night might be scary. Walking through the same forest in the daytime might be less scary. And if I'm surrounded by a bunch of people, and I'm crying because of how scared I am, that might be regarded as inappropriately cowardly, right? Or we could just say cowardly, right? And so what we're supposed to imagine, Aristotle thinks, is that imagine a line, and that line and each point on that line represents a different level of fearful you could feel, a different level of fear you could feel. On the one end, there's cowardly, and on the other end, there's reckless. Which point we should be at in that line varies from circumstance to circumstance. The appropriate, the intermediate, the mean varies from circumstance to circumstance. That's why the average, the mean, the intermediate, and so on isn't like the mathematical mean or mathematical average, which just always is the same place, right? Between 2 and 4, the average is always the same. But between cowardly and reckless, the average isn't the same. The median or mean or intermediate is not always the same. Um, and that's a very, very important point for Aristotle. So we could identify two possible extremes in this case: super reckless, super cowardly, and each one of those is going to be a vice, and um, each intermediate in any particular emotion, each intermediate, that's going to be the character virtue. You have the character virtue when you have the appropriate level of feeling or emotion in that situation. And in some situation, the appropriate might look like having none of that emotion at all. For example, anger. Yes, Aristotle thinks that anger is appropriate in some situations. For example, at some gross injustice or crime committed against your family, you should be very angry. But in some other situations, for example, if I'm eating dinner alone, by myself, and I'm just enjoying my meal, and all of a sudden I start feeling huge amounts of anger, that's a mistake. In fact, I probably should feel exactly no anger, assuming that we're not imagining anything else happening in this dinner table, at this dinner table. So there are going to be some cases where what's appropriate is going to be feeling none of that emotion at all. But still, in general, we're not eliminating emotions. We're just bringing them in line with what's appropriate, with what's right to the circumstance. And so one crucial feature of character virtues is that there are means between extremes. Now, you might wonder how we get a character virtue, and that is a process we call habituation. And habituation is related to the Greek words that Aristotle is actually using to talk about character virtues in the first place. So we call them character virtues in English. In Greek, the phrase character virtue is ethike arete, and that means something like, in a very literal way, virtue of habit or habitual virtue or something like that. The Greek word for habituate, the Greek verb is ethao, and that is providing really the etymological root here. So when we're talking about character virtues, we're really talking about something like virtues we have by habituation. And so that leads us to our second important feature of character virtues, which is that they're habituated. So for Aristotle, you can't have a character virtue just by luck. You need to feel the right emotion at the right time in the right way for the right reasons, and this correct emotion needs to flow naturally from your character, from a stable and unchanging character. So, for example, if I walk through a forest at night and I'm a very cowardly person, but in this one case I'm keeping a brave face, and it's just because I want to impress people by not screaming and crying, that doesn't make me courageous, even though, yes, I have performed the appropriate action in that situation. Um, even if we agreed that I felt the right amount of fear in that one situation, which might not be the case, right? It could just be that I'm putting on a brave face, but actually feeling an inappropriate amount of fear. But even if I'm somehow feeling the right amount of fear, still Aristotle would say that I'm not a courageous person. I've just done a courageous activity once in my life. Instead, I need to repeatedly perform this action. I need to do it again and again and again and again. Um, and eventually I will develop this habit. For some people will, instead of talking about character virtues as habits, they'll instead call them dispositions or tendencies. But that captures the same idea, which is that it needs to be like second nature. And as anyone who's played an instrument before or gotten really good at a sport before knows, that the only way you can make some of these things second nature is by practice, by repeated exposure to the thing in question. And Aristotle thinks you become a courageous person just like you become a good guitarist by repeatedly playing the guitar, by repeatedly being a virtuous person, by continually practicing this. And eventually it will just flow naturally from your character. One of the ways you will know whether when you are fully virtuous, when you actually have the character virtue, is that the action that you're considering will appear different to you. So, for example, a cowardly person, a person who's truly unabashedly cowardly, is just going to be completely convinced that um, uh, being brave or being courageous is unpleasant, impossible for me. No, just can't do it. I just will never change. I'll never be different. But someone who's courageous is going to look on that action and not be super turned off or deterred from it. In fact, a truly courageous person might find that a cowardly action is just massively unpleasant to even consider doing. And so it's similarly going to happen like playing a really complicated song or lifting a really heavy weight. We're going to get there by working up to it slowly. And by slow, repeated, gradual exposure, we will learn how to do this action in a way that ultimately makes it feel natural to us. That's when we know we have the character virtue. Now, intellectual virtues, on the other hand, are very different. Intellectual virtues are virtues of the part of us that has reason in it. It So the part of us that obeys reason, this is the part of us that part obeys when it's actually obeying reason. And having intellectual virtues, therefore, is crucial for actually having character virtues, because can come into being when the part of us that has emotions is actually obeying a part of us that's behaving rationally, right? That's being rational. If for example we're supposed to imagine the character virtues, or the part of us that is capable of the character virtues, as like a child obeying a father, well, the child's actions are only as good as the father's advice. And so the father needs to have really, really, really good advice. And that's represented in this analogy by the intellectual virtues. When the part of us that has reason can actually reason well. So when I say to you the phrase intellectual virtue, you might immediately think of something like open mindedness or toleration or something like that. Those are not actually intellectual virtues for Aristotle. They're much more like character virtues because, for example, they have means, they have intermediates. There's such a thing as being too open minded, and there's such a thing as being not open minded enough. Just like there's such a thing as being too patient or not patient enough, or too friendly and not friendly enough. That's a hallmark of character virtues. That's why I spent so much time talking about means between extremes. That's a hallmark of character virtues. And similarly, when it comes to toleration, there's such a thing as being too tolerant, and there's such a thing as being not tolerant enough. Instead, intellectual virtues don't have means at all. So, intellectual virtues, one thing that makes them different from a character virtue is that they are simply not means between extremes. They don't admit of extremes, and they don't admit of means or intermediates at all. Intellectual virtues, on the other hand, are pieces of knowledge. They're things you should know or can know. They are the sort of pieces of knowledge that, in one way or another, improve our minds by our knowing of them, by our knowing them. So I'll give examples of this momentarily, but I'll also mention the other difference between intellectual virtues and character virtues, which is that intellectual virtues are not acquired by habituation, they are acquired by learning, which fits with what I just said. Since you don't develop them, of course, you won't develop them by habituation because they're not means, and of course, you would learn them because they are in fact pieces of knowledge instead. So, and then of course, all of the differences between intellectual virtues and character virtues can be subsumed within the larger difference, which is that they are virtues of different parts of us. So, intellectual virtues are not means, and they are acquired by learning instead of habituation. So, an example of an intellectual virtue is wisdom. Wisdom is a virtue that we have when we know the very, very best things. When we know the things that are eternal and unchanging and superior to everything else. Aristotle also recognizes that another kind of intellectual virtue is craft, which we might also translate as skill or expertise. The Greek word being techne, from where we get words like technical and technique. But crafts are intellectual virtues. Crafts are intellectual virtues because our minds become better by knowing them or having them with respect to some particular practice. So, for example, when it comes to carpentry, a mind is better, all else being equal, when it knows the art of carpentry than when it doesn't. So when it comes to flute playing, a mind is better, all else being equal, when it knows how to play the flute than not. And so these skills, these crafts, these expertises, they improve our minds too. And we could go through the intellectual virtues one by one and see them, and perhaps in another episode we will. But right now it behooves us just to simply say, to just simply get a grasp of what these intellectual virtues are in general, and they are the best state of the part of us that has reason, and such that this best state can perform its characteristic activity. And in this situation, character virtues depend on intellectual virtues. So one intellectual virtue is sometimes called prudence or practical wisdom. And this character virtues depend on this intellectual virtue of practical wisdom or prudence, because when our mind has practical wisdom, we can deliberate well. We can decide what is appropriate in this circumstance, what means is appropriate for the end that we've chosen in this circumstance. That's what makes practical wisdom so important, is that in a way, practical wisdom is the intellectual virtue that helps make our whole lives go well. And thus we come back to the idea that I mentioned at the start of this episode, which is that for Aristotle, virtues are supposed to slot into our lives as something that helps our lives go well. They don't make our lives go well, they're not sufficient, but they're necessary. And although we need a much longer episode to go into that theory, we can begin to get a sense of how this would work out, right? Imagine living your life without ever having the right emotions for the situation. That's not going to go over super well for your life. Imagine also that you might be the sort of person who can get your emotions to fall in line with reason, but your reason is totally clueless about what's appropriate. In that situation too, your life isn't going to go well. And even apart from the way that intellectual virtues help facilitate character virtues, it's still simply better, Aristotle thinks, to have knowledge of the very best things. For instance, there's something wretched and miserable about someone who doesn't know the very best things. And so wisdom becomes an important virtue, an important intellectual virtue. Now, as I said, by no means is this sufficient. I've said this multiple times by now. It's not sufficient. In fact, you need something like money, some amount of wealth, some amount of health, friendship, and so on to live well. But also, as I said much earlier, you need some external goods like money and health in order to have the character virtues. I mean, just try to be generous without any money. If you don't have any money, you're most likely going to have one of the vices, right, which is stinginess. And it's not going to be something you could really do anything about either. You're just not going to be able to be generous. You're going to have to be stingy with your money because you don't have a lot. By the same token, we should avoid being very wasteful as well, which is the other extreme, when people just throw their money away. Ultimately, this is how Aristotle distinguishes between the character virtues and the intellectual virtues. Of course, they're distinguished by the fact they're virtues of different things. They each have their own characteristic activity. But also, as I've said, character virtues are acquired by habituation, and they simply are habits, the dispositions, tendencies, when we do the right thing and feel the right thing at the right time in the right way for the right reasons, just like second nature to us, just like second nature. And intellectual virtues aren't that way. Intellectual virtues are not habits. They don't come through habituation. And besides, they're acquired very differently. They are fundamentally pieces of knowledge acquired by learning. And so that's how Aristotle makes his distinction. Of course, there are a ton of other questions we could ask in the neighborhood of these things, but right now, I think that it suffices. This look at least suffices for now. And in future episodes, we can come back to so many of the other important ideas related to this distinction in the Nicomachean Ethics. Thank you.